15,000 customers. That's roughly how many non-resident customers passed through Danske Bank's Estonia branch over almost a decade. A branch that's small pushed an estimated $200 billion in suspicious transactions through the international financial system. This isn't a story about a bank that failed to catch bad actors. This is a story about a bank that lied to other banks to keep the door open. Danske Bank eventually pled guilty to conspiracy to commit bank fraud, not money laundering. That distinction matters, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. I'm a CAM-certified financial crime investigator with over a decade in this field. This is the first case on this channel involving correspondent banking, the system that lets a bank in one country move US dollars without a physical presence in the United States. Here's how a small branch in Tallinn became the center of one of the largest money laundering scandals in European history. Danske Bank is Denmark's largest bank. In 2007, it acquired a small Estonian bank and inherited something called the non-resident portfolio, a group of corporate customers, overwhelmingly from Russia and other former Soviet states, who didn't live or operate in Estonia, but banked there anyway. Between 2007 and 2015, Danske Bank's own later investigation found that approximately $200 billion in transactions flowed through this non-resident portfolio, the large majority of it flagged as suspicious. Different outside estimates have put the total figure anywhere from roughly $200 billion to well over $230 billion, depending on the scope and time period counted. But every version of the number describes the same underlying picture: a branch office in Tallinn, Estonia, moving a volume of money completely disproportionate to its size. The mechanics were familiar to anyone who's watched this channel's earlier cases. Shell companies with no real operations, registered in one jurisdiction, owned by parties in another, moving money in patterns with no apparent business purpose. What's different here is who those shell companies belong to and where the money was headed. And the branch itself was tiny. By some counts, the non-resident portfolio represented a small fraction of Danske Bank Estonia's total customer count, yet for a period of years, it generated a wildly outsized share of that single branch's profit, a classic red flag on its own. When a small slice of low-touch, high-volume customers is quietly propping up a business unit's numbers, someone should be asking why. None of that money could move in US dollars without going through a correspondent bank in the United States. And that's exactly where the US Department of Justice's case begins. Here's the mechanism that makes this different from every other case in this series. Danske Bank Estonia didn't have a US banking license, and it didn't need one to matter to US regulators because it needed American banks to act as correspondents. A correspondent relationship is simple in concept. A foreign bank holds a US dollar account at an American bank, and the American bank moves dollars on the foreign bank's behalf, trusting that the foreign bank is doing its own anti-money laundering screening on the other end before the transaction ever reaches the correspondent's books. It's the plumbing that lets a bank with no US branches still move US dollars anywhere in the world. According to the Department of Justice, Danske Bank misled those US correspondent banks between 2008 and 2016 about the true nature of its Estonia branch's anti-money laundering controls in order to maintain, and in one case to open, US dollar correspondent accounts. Trusting those representations, U.S. banks processed approximately $160 billion on behalf of the non-resident portfolio, believing Danske's own screening stood behind every transaction. This is why Danske Bank pled guilty to conspiracy to commit bank fraud, not a money laundering charge. The fraud, legally, was against the U.S. banks. Danske obtained continued access to the U.S. financial system by misrepresenting its own compliance program. The laundering happened because that access was granted under false pretenses. It's a distinction worth sitting with. The criminal charge here is about what Danske told other banks, not directly about what its non-resident customers did with the money. This is also the first case in this series where an employee raised the alarm years before anyone else acted. Howard Wilkinson worked in Danske Bank's Estonia operations, and in 2013 and 2014, wrote 4 separate reports to the bank's internal audit function and senior management, describing what he'd seen in the non-resident portfolio. Those reports didn't stop the activity. The non-resident portfolio continued operating for roughly another year before Estonia's financial regulator forced Danske to begin winding it down, and the scandal itself didn't become public until 2017 and 2018, years after Wilkinson's internal reports, and years after Danske's own board reportedly discussed some of the underlying activity. The pattern is one this channel has now seen in different forms: a program that had the information it needed to act and didn't act on it fast enough. In TD Bank's case, that gap was filled by bribed employees actively working around controls. In Danske Bank's case, it looks more like a straightforward failure to escalate an internal warning into an actual response, for over a year, by the bank's own later admissions. In December 2022, Danske Bank pled guilty in the Southern District of New York to 1 count of conspiracy to commit bank fraud and agreed to forfeit approximately $2.059 billion to the United States, one of the largest forfeitures in a bank fraud case in U.S. history. Separately, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Danske Bank with securities fraud for misleading its own investors about the state of its anti-money laundering compliance in Estonia, and reached a $413 million settlement covering disgorgement, interest, and a civil penalty. Danish authorities separately imposed roughly $500 million in penalties and $171 million in forfeiture for violations of Denmark's own anti-money laundering laws during the 2013 to 2016 period. 3 different authorities, 3 different legal theories: bank fraud against U.S. correspondent banks, securities fraud against Danske's own shareholders, and a domestic Danish AML violation, all pointed at the same underlying 5-year failure inside one branch. The institutional penalties weren't the only consequence. In September 2018, once Danske Bank's own internal investigation into the Estonia branch became public, CEO Thomas Borgen resigned. An external law firm's review found that he hadn't personally breached his legal obligations, but Borgen said publicly that as the bank's chief executive, the management responsibility for what happened on his watch was his to own, and he stepped down anyway. Danish prosecutors later brought preliminary charges against Borgen and several other former executives. Those charges were dropped in 2021. The bank paid the fine. The person at the top of it lost the job regardless of what the legal findings said about personal liability. If your institution relies on correspondent banking relationships, or if you serve as a correspondent for other institutions, Danske Bank's case is the one to study because the exposure runs in both directions. If you're the correspondent bank, the lesson is that a counterparty's own representations about its AML program are not a substitute for independent due diligence, especially for a foreign branch or subsidiary with a customer base that doesn't match the rest of the institution's profile. A non-resident portfolio that generates a disproportionate share of a branch's revenue relative to its share of customers is exactly the kind of anomaly that ongoing correspondent due diligence is supposed to catch. If you're on the other side, the institution requesting or holding correspondent access, internal escalation timelines matter as much as detection. An employee raising a documented, written concern to internal audit and management is a compliance program's best-case scenario for early warning. What happens in the year or more after that report determines whether it becomes a case study in prevention or a case study like this one: a $200 billion non-resident portfolio, a 15,000 customer branch, a whistleblower ignored for over a year, and a fraud charge built on what Danske Bank told other banks, not on the underlying laundering itself. That combination is what makes this case different from everything else in this series, and it's exactly the kind of correspondent banking exposure independent program reviews are built to catch before a regulator finds it first. I'm a CAM-certified financial crime investigator with over 12 years in this field, and I built fourth pillar compliance to test exactly these gaps: program reviews, red flag testing, and interim BSA-officer support, built around the failure points that actually show up in real enforcement actions like this one. I left the same free red flags checklist in the description. If you want to understand how these cases actually get built, not the headline, the mechanics, subscribe. Educational only, not legal advice. Everything here from public court filings and regulator press releases. I'll see you in the next one.